The lighting for my waterfall was working nicely, though the method I'd used to fix the lights in place while adjustable was rather delicate. But before I tried for a firmer solution, I was also a little bothered by the shape of the light against the background. I thought this was down to the rounded pinholes of the lift arm the lights were fixed into, so I swapped it for a clear lift arm, but the issue still persisted. It turned out it was simply down to the projection of the light itself. I could reduce the effect by moving the light further away, but without something to diffuse the light, I was going to have to accept it to some degree. With the current system, I didn't have room to move connectors closer to the front of the waterfall unless I dropped them lower or found a new way to fix the top in place. There was a half-plate gap between the top plates and the highest connection point on the front plates, which I could only see being filled with the front of a bracket. But if it could be filled with an underhanging bracket, it could also be filled with an overhanging bracket. It would just mean the bracket was more visible through the waterfall. Instead of lift arms, I attached the lights to connectors fixed between the walls, which was much more secure and easy to set the angle of. With the lights in place and turned on, it looked as though I'd need an extra layer of coverage under the brackets to prevent light leakage. At this point, I thought I'd check on the actual cost and availability of parts that I was using in the design, and discovered that the 1x2 overhanging bracket I was using was a bit of an expensive rarity. I don't mind including occasional pricey parts if they really add to the aesthetic, but I needed several of these, so I swapped it for the much cheaper, larger variant. Incidentally, I'm looking at setting up a Patreon if anybody is interested in helping fund this and future projects, though I'm not exactly sure what I would offer as rewards, so if anybody has any thoughts, let me know. One thing I was unsure about with using overhanging brackets across the front of the waterfall was the number of connection points to the front of the waterfall. The current design only had 4 studs, which was quick to connect to and disconnect from, but if every bracket was studded into the front, I was anticipating it would be much more hassle. While physically building my new design, I realised I'd once again forgotten to account for the cables, so I had to reposition the routing channels lower. But even once I'd lowered them, I still found the clear bricks I had in place above were an issue, and it looked as though light leakage may still occur. Through all the removal and installation of facade panels to test designs, I was becoming quite fed up of threading and unthreading wires through the framework, so this was another issue to look at some point. The light leakage would have to be fixed with another row of plates across the front, and I figured I could replace the clear bricks with panels to give clearance for the cables. I may have solved the light leakage and cable clearance issues, but I was still unsure of how to connect the top of the waterfall. Having removed a lot of what tied together the bridge supporting it, the connections between top plates were much weaker, and there was a risk it could be pulled away when removing the front, so I looked at how I could stagger brackets and panels to re-strengthen connections. 1x1 brackets were readily available through bricks and pieces, but I seem to have forgotten about the more expensive 1x2 bracket. Thankfully, I was still hesitant about the strength of the supporting bridge and wondering whether underhanging brackets might be better at the front again, as they could be connected more firmly to the rear brackets, and I could maybe leave out the connection to the front of the waterfall altogether. The end result was much firmer, and the front now only attached to the plates built into the facade, which would be far easier and quicker to install and remove. The lighting was also working well. I wasn't too keen on the amount of visible plating across the top, but it seemed it was necessary to cover the glow of the lights. I'd grown quite tired of repeatedly installing, connecting, disconnecting and uninstalling the lights throughout this process, largely due to how difficult power functions connectors are to separate. I was aware that power functions extension cables include a plug compatible with older 9V components, so I hatched a plan to utilise 9V plates as connection points for the upper lights. With having standard system connections, it was going to be trickier connecting 9V plates to the Technic framework, as I wouldn't want them to come away with the plug when I pulled on it, so I had to find a way to keep the plate in place when both pushed and pulled by the plug. I could easily stud the plate onto modified pins in the frame, but while I could technically add lift arms across the front of the plate as a brace to prevent it pulling away, it made more sense to use Technic bricks as a go-between. Sometimes I overcomplicate things and miss simpler solutions to problems. So when the lower flip-flop lift arm I introduced here wasn't as close to the plate as I would have liked, I went through the effort of redesigning the framework around it just so I could raise it a single module. With the plate fixed in place, however, I realised I wasn't sure which orientation the plugs needed connecting to it. To me, the metal contacts made it appear that the plug would have to be connected with the cables following the length of the plate, so I thought I'd have to rotate the plate to give the cables space, but then realised this would make no difference, and I just needed to move the Technic bricks further out. My plan would ideally involve the plug coming with the facade panel when pulled, but I thought the clutch power between plug and plate would be too great to be overcome by pulling on the facade, and then I realised there were only 2 studs on the tops of the plugs. If I couldn't pull the plug with the facade, I got thinking it may be best to detach the lights from the facade and fix them to the frame instead, then I wouldn't be left awkwardly holding the facade panels while trying to detach the plugs. Counting how many units I could move the lights in either direction, there really wasn't much wiggle room, and I found the amount of movement wouldn't allow the Technic connectors to align with the framework in any usable way, not even with offset connectors. I was able to acquire some 9V plates for the next session, and discovered that plugs could operate in either orientation of connection. But before I began modifying the framework for the plate, I realised I couldn't raise the small frame as I had in the design as the water was resting on it, which was going to make it more difficult raising the larger frame beneath it. I instead left the framework as it was and used longer connectors to the plate, which worked just fine, but I was going to have an issue with the lift arms it was connected to, thanks once again to those pesky cables. If I threaded them behind the lift arm, it would completely defeat the purpose of using the easier to remove 9V system, but they couldn't pass over the front of either lift arm. I realised if I moved over the Technic bricks at one end of the plate, it would open up the space at that end to freely move the cables around the lift arms. The other cables shouldn't need to be disconnected, and would be threaded through the framework to connect to the lights for the other side of the waterfall. Once the cables were in place, I had a brief moment thinking the lights were doing what I hoped they wouldn't do, turning one set on and the other set off because of the orientation of the plugs, but thankfully realised I'd simply connected the second set of lights to the wrong point. With the lights working, I made my first attempt to connect the facade panels back in place, but found the left side reluctant to connect to the frame. I still don't know what caused this issue. None of the cables appeared to be trapped, and it went on perfectly on my second attempt. The cables didn't exactly tuck away neatly, but there was adequate room. I considered the possibility of cutting the power functions plug from the lights and splicing on a 9V plug, but it felt a bit extreme, plus then I'd have to use extensions to convert them back to power functions in future. With one side designed, it was time for the other, and I started by breaking up the large Technic frame into smaller ones and moving a connector further inbound, as I was still experiencing the cable pinching between the frame and wall while pushing the facade panel into place. Connecting the lights and installing the facade panels was now a far easier operation, though I may still have to do something about the lengths of cables stuffed into the framework. There was a slight concern they could interfere with the stepper mechanism for the spike trap, but for now it was up and running.